First thing I'll say is that we're going to be recording the session. So if you don't want to be, if you don't want your face to be recorded, then switch your cameras off. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It is awesome to see so many people here. Lots of names and faces that I recognize, but plenty more that I don't. So I'm really glad that there's a few of you, hopefully where this is your first interaction with the Young Greens. Welcome to the second session of our Pillars of Green Politics series, which we started off last week. We've got a really exciting session coming up with two brilliant guest speakers. Again, I'll be doing a short introduction before handing over to the panelists, who are going to speak probably for around 15-20 minutes each or so, and before we share your questions with them. My name's Johan. I'm the Young Greens Activist Training and Political Education Officer. Managed to get it all out, good. For this session, we're going to be talking about climate justice and the Green New Deal, which is really, really exciting. But last week, we started on our political education series journey. So we were talking about the development of green politics as born out of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. And in coming together into a cohesive political approach, to be green kind of became defined by those intertwined pillars of ecology, social justice, non-violence, and democracy. And in following the recent history of environmental politics, it is very hard to ignore the role the Green New Deal has played in debate. The Green New Deal has become a core organizing platform of the climate movement in Europe and the United States. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York has played a crucial role in popularizing this approach, arguing for the need to rapidly invest in climate mitigation measures and green jobs to tackle the climate emergency. The Green New Deal has also had a long association with green politics. Following the 2008 financial crisis, Caroline Lucas was part of a group of activists, academics, and political representatives calling for a Green New Deal as a way to tackle economic and environmental challenges together. And then just last year, Caroline was again at the forefront of a campaign for a Green New Deal in the UK by bringing forward the Green New Deal bill to the UK Parliament. The bill, written with the help of civil society groups, scientists, and unions, has been pushed forward by the youth-led activist group Green New Deal Rising. So in any examination of the pillars of green politics, and particularly a closer look at ecology, the Green New Deal has to be part of the conversation. But it can also be so much more than just an environmental program, as we will hear about shortly. So for tonight, we're going to start with what the Green New Deal is all about, before we hear about the potential justice implications of climate policies. Throughout the discussion, I'll be gathering questions to be shared with the panel once they've finished speaking. So if you have a question and you'd like to ask, please message me directly in the chat. You can see that I've got questions here in my Zoom name, so it should be easy enough to navigate. If your question is for one specific panelist, then please do indicate as such. Otherwise, I will make a determination, or I'll ask it to both if it's applicable. If you have any technical problems tonight, then please message Kelsey, who has tech questions in the Zoom name, and we'll try and help sort through any problems there. If you require captions during the meeting tonight, then you should be able to switch them on along the bottom by clicking on the captions icon. We also have Jane on hand, who is one of our safeguarding officers. So if you have any questions or concerns in that regard, please send a message to Jane directly. She's also going to drop our Safe Spaces guidance in the chat. This guidance is in place for this meeting, and we expect attendees to abide by it. So our first speaker then is Ellen Lees. Ellen is a former campaigns officer at We Own It and is now the digital organizer with Green New Deal Rising. Green New Deal Rising, as I mentioned earlier, is an organisation that is pretty difficult to ignore in the current climate of UK environmental politics. They hold politicians to account across political parties, and they have really big plans in 2022 and beyond to make the Green New Deal an era-defining political issue. So Ellen's going to introduce us to the Green New Deal and explore some of the ways in which the Green New Deal Rising are looking to shift the debate in UK environmental politics. So over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Johan. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. I have some slides. There we go. Everyone see those? Great. Okay. So my name's Ellen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an organizer with Green New Deal Rising. And I'm going to, like Johan said, give an overview of the Green New Deal, what it is, why we need it. And then I'm going to cover our plan to win a Green New Deal, what that means in the UK, and how we think we're going to do it. So to set the scene, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Green New Deal Rising. We are a movement of young people from every part of the UK fighting for a better future that we all deserve and that we all know is possible. We're millennials and Gen Z. We come from towns devastated by cuts, and we grew up in cities choked by air pollution. We are Black, brown and white, queer, trans and disabled, in school, college and at university, in work and unemployed. We've grown up in an age of crisis. We've watched floods and fires destroy lives from Dhaka to Doncaster. We see the crisis of racial injustice play out every day. A secure job, a decent home and financial security are impossible for most of us. And we see politicians again and again failing to do what's necessary. But we also know what it feels like to be powerful. We rise up when we take to the streets for Black lives. We rise up when we strike for the climate, and we rise up when we knock every door in the wind and rain in a battle for our future. And we'll keep rising up, because the only thing that has ever altered the course of history is a huge disruptive movement willing to do what it takes to win. We are young people from all walks of life, and we will not be silenced. We are coming together now to demand the future we all deserve. We are the generation that will win a Green New Deal. So that's a little spiel. Our aims as an organisation, as a movement, are to A, expose the Tories as a party of climate delay, B, to realign opposition parties around a Green New Deal and show the sort of clear water between that opposition and the Conservative Party, build majority public support for the Green New Deal by reaching out into our communities and explaining what it is and how it will build a better future for everyone, and then make a Green New Deal an election-defining issue. I'm going to talk about how we might do that in a minute, but first, what is the Green New Deal and why are we fighting for it? So the Green New Deal is, for us, it's not just a plan to survive, it's a plan to thrive. It's a 10-year game-changing plan to transform our world at the speed and scale that we require, with people and communities front and center. It's a plan that would deliver a good green job to everyone that needs one, would deliver a warm and affordable home to everyone who needs one. It's a plan to put power back into the hands of communities, whether that's through publicly owned transport or making sure we put workers and local communities first as we're moving on from the era of fossil fuels. It's a plan to stop huge parts of the world from going underwater and to redistribute wealth and support and resources to places that need it around the world. And it's a plan that reprograms our economy so that it's people, communities, and ecosystems that matter, not profit. It's not about incremental change. We know that the problems we face are huge and connected, and the Green New Deal for us is the solution that is big enough and fast enough to face those problems head on. We know that big change is possible. We've seen it before. When people rise up and force decision makers to really feel the pressure, transformation can happen. And as a movement, we stand on the shoulders of other movements that fought until governments listened, until they built the NHS, until they gave everybody the right to vote and the right to love who they wanted to love. But they won't make those big changes without a fight. There's too many vested interests, as we know, holding them back. So the Green New Deal can't be defined by a single policy. It's a vision for a better future. And it's made up of, it's a plan that's made up of many policies, which all build towards this new system in which we can not only survive the climate breakdown that has already started to happen, started to affect people around the world, but that we can thrive. So as Green New Deal Rising, our main focus is taking action and bringing people on board into the movement at the moment. We don't spend a lot of time debating the specific policies of the Green New Deal because there are other organizations in the movement who are much better placed to do that, who do the research and the policy work that is vital so that we can take that forward and be the advocates for it that we are. We have 5 principles that we want the Green New Deal to meet as a movement. So I'm going to go through those now. So we do have a sort of rough definition of what we think the Green New Deal is, but we do tend to leave the nitty-gritty policy details to other allies in the movement and develop those exact policies, people like the New Economics Foundation and the trade unions and civil society groups who wrote the original Green New Deal that Johan mentioned earlier. So with that caveat, here's the 5 essential elements that we think need to make up the Green New Deal. First one is to decarbonize fast, specifically reaching zero carbon by 2030. We need to end our dependence on dirty fuels, and we need to build an economy based on 100% clean energy. The idea is to totally decarbonize the economy of the UK in a way that enhances the lives of ordinary people, workers and communities, and works to eliminate social and economic inequality. So these are some examples of policies that should be included as part of that. It's not an exhaustive list. There are loads more, but some things could be a mass program of home insulation, retrofitting heat pumps, warming homes, lowering bills and reducing emissions, public ownership of public services, including transport, water, and energy suppliers, with a duty to ensure access and reduce consumption so that our utilities are run for public good and not profit. 100% renewable energy from a mixture of community-owned renewables and larger suppliers, and subsidised buses run for the public benefit so that public transport is always cheaper than driving. A second principle is jobs. So the Green New Deal is a way to create millions of new, well-paid, secure, unionised jobs because there's so much work to do. If we want to move towards this society, this decarbonised society, there is a lot of work to do. So we create these jobs across the country that can guarantee healthy and fulfilling livelihoods for all workers and communities, including those in today's high emission sectors. So that means millions of government created good green jobs in green infrastructure and in the care economy, with regional worker-led just transition strategies for shifting the economy from the high carbon sector like fossil fuels or arms and industrial agriculture to renewables, nature-friendly farming, or health and care industries. Included in this is a green jobs guarantee and a 4-day week as a way of moving towards a lower carbon society, rebalance our work and leisure time, share out the work, and help us to live happier and healthier lives. Principle number 3 is about transforming the economy. So the financial systems serve the needs of the people on the planet, and so that our government is accountable to people, not to corporations. We believe that our economy has to work in the interest of everyone, with greater democratic participation, accountability, and common ownership, empowering communities that are currently marginalized and respecting natural ecological limits. So this means ending austerity once and for all, investing in our public services, ending the transfer of wealth from public to private sector. It means changing the Treasury rules to ensure that all public investment is aligned with climate targets. And it means working internationally to end the race to the bottom on corporate tax, workers' rights, and environmental standards, including through the really awful trade law system. Principle number 4 is about protecting and restoring vital habitats and carbon sinks, including forests and wild areas, and ensuring the provision of clean air, water, green spaces, and a healthy environment for all. So some things that could be included in this would be establishing a national nature service in order to create jobs in things like reforestation, conservation and nature-based flood prevention. It could be supporting farmers to adopt nature-friendly farming methods through subsidies, training, public procurement policy, and access to land, so that they farm in a way that protects our air, our soil, and our water. We need to make polluters pay for the environmental harm they cause by enforcing legal liability with adequate damage payments and/or criminal convictions for the worst offenders. And we need to stick to the fundamental principle of public money for public goods. So public money paid to farmers must provide essential public goods or benefits like wildlife, soil health, water and air quality, natural flood management that aren't already rewarded by the market. And last but probably most importantly, promote global justice by supporting all peoples and countries to decarbonize quickly and fairly in line with the timeframes set out by science. So the Green New Deal will ensure that the UK does its fair share to tackle climate breakdown and more to account for historic emissions and the exploitation of resources and communities, particularly in the global south. So the UK should reach zero carbon by 2030, which I think is earlier than our official sort of doing our share according to the global community, in order that other countries might take a little longer. We need to end all UK financing of fossil fuel extraction overseas. We need to honour climate finance obligations, which have so far been ignored, to developing countries in full and on time. And in cooperation with other developed nations, the UK has to replenish the Green Climate Fund, in particular, to ratchet up climate action so that we can stay below 1.5 degrees and fulfill the commitments that those developed countries have made. In the sort of atmosphere post-COP, some of these, there's a lot more that could be added, particularly to this principle. I think it's changing all the time. But those are the 5 pillars of our Green New Deal. Hopefully that's given everyone a better sense of what we think the Green New Deal in action could look like. And everyone in our movement has a different story to tell, and everyone is motivated by different parts of the Green New Deal vision. It could be solar panels on your block of flats. It could be ending the hostile environment against migrants and refugees. It could be having access to clean, affordable energy, tackling racial injustice, advancing reproductive justice, having a secure and well-paid job where you're treated with respect, or investing in health and social care for children and adults. I'd love to hear what some of the more compelling and exciting elements of the Green New Deal are for you guys. If you wanted to drop in the chat what you're excited about, always keen to hear what people find compelling about this. So now you know what the Green New Deal is. I'm going to very quickly run you through how we plan to win it. So over the next few years, our goal is to make the Green New Deal an era-defining issue. The idea that everyone is talking about, it's all over the news, and that everyone is voting on. So as young people, we plan to cause widespread disruption to the political system until politicians face up to the scale of the climate crisis. We force them to choose a side. Are you with us or are you against us? And we challenge them everywhere. We make it very difficult to do their day jobs. We grab headlines and we attract more young people into the movement. At the same time, we go out into our communities and talk to everybody we can about the Green New Deal. We know there's a massive demand for big, bold action on the climate crisis. We just need to turn that demand into a huge majority for the Green New Deal. So these two things together, widespread disruption and community outreach, are how we'll win. They've been so important to movements in the past, and they're our secret to making the Green New Deal an era-defining issue. So as we grow and the next election nears, we will set our sights on political power. So we want to elect inspiring Green New Deal champions to join Caroline Lucas in Parliament and take down the climate delaying politicians who are destroying our planet. We launched in August 2021, And since then, we've laid some strong foundations for our movement. We did an action in the Houses of Parliament, and we've continued taking action ever since. Our main focus in 2021 was disrupting the political narrative by challenging politicians to back the Green New Deal in public. So you might have seen one or two of our videos on social media of Green New Deal Rising activists challenging politicians to decide if they're with us or against us, including Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, and Nicola Sturgeon. Politician challenges like this one are one of our main tactics. We have a brilliant research team who finds events that MPs are going to turn up to, and we assign these to challenge teams, and they go there and they challenge the MPs to be brave and back the Green New Deal bill. If they do, we celebrate them, and we have a nice video confirming another ally in Parliament. And if they don't, we call them out, and we have usually an even more viral video exposing the politician as a climate delayer. If you haven't seen any of our videos, check out our Twitter to see some of them. So that brings you on to our plans for the future. In 2022, we've got 3 strands to the plan: go big, break through, and get election ready. We need to go big by growing our movement exponentially from the hundreds to the thousands and the tens of thousands. We need to break through into the mainstream, make newspapers, and define the news so that the Green New Deal is something that everyone on the street knows about rather than just climate activists. And we need to get election ready. It might seem a little premature, but always good to be ready. And there might be a general election as early as 2023, or, I mean, who knows with what's going on at the moment. We need our movement to be ready as soon as possible, to be electing MPs who are Green New Deal champions, who can fly the flag for the Green New Deal and fight our fight within the halls of Parliament. One of the ways we're going to do that is with a new tactic that we're calling digital canvassing. So digital canvassing is a really simple but powerful tactic that anyone can do anywhere at any time. At its core, it's about reaching out to people online and having one-on-one persuasive conversations with them to get them on side. The idea is if we do this in a really strategic and targeted way, we can use these conversations to make sure that we get a load more Green New Deal champion MPs elected. So we recruit a team of people by reaching out to them online, and then they go out and speak to people in real life in their community to convince them to vote for our champion. So that's digital canvassing. We use our social media accounts to reach out to people in places where we can elect Green New Deal champions so that we can build our strength there for when the election comes. And we won't just protect current Green New Deal champions with this strategy, we'll also get new champions elected in other places across the country. And that is our big new tactic for the year. So that's pretty much it from me. I'm happy to answer any questions, obviously, and excited to hear from Harpreet as well. I'd love for anyone in the Young Greens to join up and be part of Green New Deal Rising. I think we could work together as organisations as well. There's a lot of overlap. So I'm going to drop the link to our website in the chat if anyone's interested, and you can sign up for a welcome call there. But I will stop there.
Awesome, thanks very much, Ellen. Yeah, that was a really interesting overview, and there's already obviously loads of things firing off in my head, and loads of areas of potential collaboration and things like that. So brilliant, thank you very much. Yes, what I was going to say is that you know, it's obviously been really great to see how Green New Deal Rising have been making the Green New Deal a key political issue. Obviously, we are biased here, but we think that the Young Greens and the wider Green Party are feeding into as well, particularly when we're standing, you know, unequivocally for this kind of radical action that needs to happen, and winning on that platform as well. I think what's really interesting about your talk, Ellen, was what was hinted at is that, you know, the Green New Deal is not just an environmental program. It's so much more than that. You know, it's about economic transformation, as you spoke about, and it's provides an opportunity to kind of fix the inequalities that define our system. But obviously not all climate policy has justice running through it. So we thought that it'd be really, really important to center justice in this discussion. And, even a Green New Deal can potentially exacerbate inequalities or, exacerbate colonial patterns of wealth accumulation as well. So it's really important that we have that understanding of climate justice, and we really seek to embed it in all of our environmental thinking. So our next speaker, Harpreet Kaur, is going to provide some more oversight on the need to center justice in climate politics. So Harpreet is a human rights lawyer, a writer, and a researcher. She's co-edited the book Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal, which centers the voice of climate justice advocates from around the world. And she has co-hosted Planet B, a podcast based on the insights from that book, and written the report Towards a Reparative Climate Justice for the think tank Commonwealth. So without further ado, over to you, Harpreet.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today as well. And it's been super inspiring to see the energy and excitement behind a framework that is connecting economic justice with climate action. And one of the key elements when thinking about justice is absolutely around thinking about how communities that need to transition from oil and gas within the UK, from car manufacturing, from other unsustainable industries will need to be part of articulating what a transition looks like and have the opportunities for retraining and jobs. But part of it is also a component of global justice, which we started to hear a little bit about, and which I'll try and dig into more during the time in which I'll speak. And why is global justice an important part of climate justice? So you may have heard the phrase that those that have contributed least to the climate crisis are on the forefront of the impacts. And as I'm speaking, communities like those in the Philippines are experiencing sea level rise, flooding, super typhoons, despite having contributed a very small proportion of emissions historically to the crisis. And developed countries are responsible for over 90% of the excess emissions, and historically committed to paying around $100 billion of climate financing to help countries transition, to help communities transition, but also to help build resilience, to build flood defenses, to grow mangroves that are natural defenders to the encroachment of seas and flooding. And yet, when looking into the details of that, what we find is something like 80% of the money that's been provided so far is in the form of for-profit loans, essentially profiting from a crisis that they are historically responsible for. And not only that, the level of commitment that developed countries have made for taking action is really falling far short of their fair share of effort. So if we were to fairly allocate the amount of emissions in the atmosphere across the world by population, if we're serious about meeting the 1.5 target, which as communities in the Pacific and in communities in countries that are already experiencing extreme droughts and heat waves would say is what we absolutely need to be able to survive in a way that is capable of maintaining access to water, to food, to land that communities need to be able to withstand impacts, then the UK's used up 200% of its budget. And that means that it needs to take really ambitious and bold action to decarbonize the ways in which we move, the ways in which we eat, the ways in which we heat our homes and keep them warm in the winter and cool in the summer. But it also means that the UK has to bear responsibility for the fact that its historic actions have contributed to impacts in the global south. And part of that means its ambitions within the UK, putting dates forward, making plans based on technology that exists, on renewable energy, on retrofitting homes, and not fanciful reliance on technologies that haven't been tested, and not on projects that view territories in the global south as territories that can be filled with solar panels, as though communities there don't also need energy, and filled with non-Indigenous trees that are potentially contributing to water scarcity, and when they're not contributing towards increasing biodiversity and promoting forests that exist already in communities but are monocultures like eucalyptus, not only promote water insecurity but actually increase hazards like fire risk as well in communities. And at the moment, 40% of the UK's ambition is relying on untested technologies and on tree plantation schemes that could not only not work, but also has displacement implications for communities in the global south, where a lot of these plans are earmarked, and access to water. The other thing that I wanted to say about a renewable energy transition is that is also a transition that is reliant on raw earth minerals and metals, many of which are mined in South America and in Southeast Asia and in the African continent, often in conditions of precarious labor standards for communities that are mining the ingredients that are necessary for wind, solar, electric car batteries. And what that means at the bare minimum is that when we will see the Greater London Authority, other public purchasers within the UK commit to making sure their next fleets are electric and ambitious transition plans, that those plans have within them embedded human rights compliance of how those technologies are being sourced, so that when, to take an example, the Greater London Authority says our next fleets will all be electric buses, that the batteries that contain the raw earth minerals haven't been made in conditions of child labor, in conditions of exposure to toxic chemicals that have disproportionate impacts on women, on health, on communities in terms of water contamination, and where workers are often working 60 to 80 hours a week in very, very precarious, unionized conditions. And so how can we begin to think about justice even within the context of moving to net zero within the UK, and to kind of give a bit of context to what I'm describing. I've sent a link to a video to Kelsey and was hoping that that could be shown. If not, I'll put it generally in the chat and hope that somebody else that does have powers is able to show that video at this time.
Give me 2 seconds, let me just see if my laptop will let me share it. It's being really slow, I apologize. Bear with me, sorry. Could you pop it over to Jane as well? She might be able to share it. My laptop's been restarted, I apologise.
I think you should all hopefully be able to see that. I'm going to press play and we'll see if the sound works.
The climate crisis is now imminent and swift action is needed. The EU is gearing itself to promote electric vehicles to combat the crisis. Germany sees 14 million electric vehicles by year 2030. Tesla expects annual sales of 20 million electric vehicles by 2030. The International Energy Agency, the World Bank, and other international institutions claim, however, that massive mining of rare and precious metals will be necessary to meet this production. What would this demand bring to the environment? We have a reason to be concerned, and you should be too. High-capacity batteries required for the energy transition need various rare metals for them to be reliably functional. A key metal required to produce these high-capacity batteries is nickel. Nickel may seem like a common metal used in cooking utensils and coins, but it can only be found in certain places on Earth and cannot be found just anywhere. One such place is the Philippines, in the final frontier, the paradise island of Palawan.
The fact that Palawan is the last ecological frontier of the Philippines is a very significant concern. About 50% of the remaining old-growth forests are found in this beautiful province. Palawan may look lush and bountiful, but it is fragile because it's a steep, long island province, and the topsoil is thin. And because the topsoil is thin, if you remove the forest, there can be high erodibility. And right now, we are vulnerable. As a province, we do have our share of heavy rains and also covered by typhoons.
The Rio Tuba nickel mine that supplies material to notable battery and automakers across the globe is moving forward to expand to nearly 4 times the present size.
Palawan is so rich in nickel. Southern Palawan is the site of several nickel mining operations. And we have seen the devastation, the deforestation, the change in the natural forest landscape because nickel mining is essentially done in natural forest areas. The issue now is because they want to expand, and the expansion area are natural forests. So we have strongly argued that when you talk about environmental impact, you basically do not comply with the law. You contravene the law because the law says areas of maximum protection include natural forest. Now, other impacts besides the forest is, of course, water. Example, the presence of hexavalent chromium, okay, in Rio Tuba. So almost every year that there is a finding and that has not been fully addressed, we documented reports of skin ailments, skin lesions from a community in Rio Tuba. It is a big environmental justice issue for us. It is not fair for people, particularly indigenous peoples, the vulnerable communities in a developing country like the Philippines, to suffer the brunt of, energy transition because it is not a just transition.
The world desperately needs a swift energy transition in order to avoid further climate devastation. However, a just transition cannot happen without the participation of local actors, including indigenous peoples, local residents, and workers involved in the mining and production phases. Unfortunately, many mining companies in the Philippines and Indonesia ignore the voices of the local people. A habitat loss for those communities is a habitat loss for us all. An energy transition without justice benefits no one.
Thank you so much for showing that. I'm going to put a link to another video, which you might want to watch in your own time, also in the Philippines, which further goes into some of the human rights implications of the mining that is going on in that country in particular. And I also wanted to point out that just after Christmas, a super typhoon hit the Philippines, implicating something like 4 million people, some of which have been displaced, some of which have lost access to energy, have lost access to water and food. And there's a kind of double injustice in the countries that are being asked to provide the minerals and metals that we need to be able to make the transition that is so very necessary, are also at the forefront of bearing the brunt of some of the worst extreme weather events, which IPCC reports have said are increasing in regularity and in their strength because of anthropogenic climate change. And so this requires both a different way of engaging in trade, in promoting human rights and sustainability, in supply chain justice, but it also highlights again the need for developed countries that have disproportionately contributed to emissions to ensure that communities that are being impacted by more flooding, by more extreme wildfires, disease spread, heat stress, water stress, glaciers melting, causing flooding, etc., aren't left to pick up the pieces of these events with limited resources, given that they contributed so very little to this crisis. And given the long history of colonialism and slavery, and research has shown that exposure to certain colonial practices have led to patterns of poverty today. So not only were these countries ravaged by colonialism, and for the African continent by slavery, which was linked to huge ecocide as areas made way for plantations, also have economies that have suffered because of that, have become indebted and are paying huge amounts of debt back to those that they've taken loans from, that are profiting from, and often those that they're paying debts back to were colonizers or are now companies or multilateral institutions that are heavily influenced by colonizers. And this long history requires justice to be at its core. And that means both very practically looking to ensure things like human rights compliance in the procurement of renewable energy, which is something that Electronics Watch, one of the organizations that produced the video that you just saw, has been very successful at doing and is trying to do for electric car batteries going forward. So a very practical thing would be to check whether your university, whether your local authority, your NHS trust, whatever public purchaser that you might have some agency within, is a member of Electronics Watch, because they are trying to promote and protect human rights of those working in supply chains that are relevant to electric car batteries in particular, but also considering expanding to solar and wind in the future. But also that when we talk about justice, we're not just talking about justice for workers and communities within the UK that need their fuel prices reduced, that need sustainable ways of travel and healthy and sustainable food and renewable energy, but also global justice, given the fact that on a per capita basis, the UK, those of us in the UK continue to emit something like 20 times more than somebody in the Philippines and countries similar, and we are continuing to perpetuate that injustice. And certainly watching and calling out UK plans for net zero that are reliant on territories in the south and are implicated in really unhelpful ways of viewing land and territories, whether it's plans to kind of displace Indigenous communities to make way for mass solar panels, and that has water implications and land access implications, or for, as I said earlier, monoculture tree plantations, which again have been implicated in displacing communities, in reducing access to water and access to land, harvest food, and often don't work when those trees are not indigenous to trees and are not part of protecting and promoting old growth forests that need to be prioritized. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harpreet. That was really, really insightful, really fascinating. I learnt a lot, and I'm sure everyone else as well is suddenly thinking about all, it sort of sparked a lot of debates in our own minds. And I would very much recommend, if you want to continue to talk about or hear more about and read more about climate justice, then I would really recommend listening to the podcast I mentioned earlier, Planet B, which Harpreet was involved with, or reading the Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal book as well. Yeah, it's really refreshing to kind of hear voices from the Global South to really provide insight into climate politics, those voices that are so often excluded from mainstream debates. So I'll allow you maybe a couple of minutes to catch your breath, and we are going to turn ourselves over to some questions, but I'll direct the first couple of questions towards Ellen. Yes, I will start the question off with, I guess, talking a little bit specifically about kind of Green New Deal Rising and some sort of tactical questions, I guess, Ellen. I'm going to kind of try and bunch these together, but I thought you mentioned community outreach, which I thought was really, really interesting. And that kind of ties into what Harpreet was saying about, actually involving not just necessarily the environmental movement has often been far too insular and hasn't really reached out well enough in the past. So I was interested if you could talk a bit more about community outreach, and then I was also going to, I guess, slightly tie that to a question about kind of where the inspiration for Green New Deal Rising has come from, and are there any other sort of international organizations that do this really well that we can also look for further inspiration further afield?
Okay, great, thanks, Johan, and thanks so much, Harpreet. That was really interesting. Community outreach as a tactic for us is at the moment focused on battleground areas that we are in the process of identifying as being important in a potential election. And so we're trying to be really strategic and targeted in our recruitment and our canvassing so that we can elect these Green New Deal champions. We're pragmatic about a potential election. The Labour Party is not by any means fully behind a Green New Deal that we're describing. And I would say probably our best result, this might be premature to say, would be a small Labour majority with a good chunk of Green New Deal champions making up that, what's the word for when different parties join a government together? You all know what this is.
Coalition.
A coalition government with a strong sort of cohort of Green New Deal champions who would then hold the balance of power potentially. But having said that, reaching out into communities more generally in order to sort of build that support for a Green New Deal and to make it into that era defining issue is also really, really crucial. So at the moment, we're doing that mostly by trying to recruit young people directly into the movement from, maybe not your usual suspects of environmental activists. We're trying to embody the kind of diversity of the country and of young people in the country in particular in a really intentional way, because we can't win without everyone, and because if we do win, it won't be justice and it won't be the, you know, the victory that we think it is, if it's just come from a bunch of white university educated middle class people, to put it bluntly. So we are, yeah, we're working really hard on trying to recruit to the movement directly from communities who are not usually represented in the climate, or haven't historically been represented in the what we think of as the climate movement. Having said that, a lot of people who you wouldn't necessarily think of as climate activists have been on the forefront of fighting for climate justice in different ways. They're just not necessarily the typical picture you might have of a climate activist, should we say. The inspiration for Green New Deal Rising, I mean, before we were Green New Deal Rising, we were Green New Deal UK, who was a slightly different formation of an organisation, organising all ages in local groups around the country. We decided to shift because we saw the moral power that young people have, in particular, in fighting for a future. We were inspired a lot by the youth strikers, by the Fridays for Future movement across Europe and in the UK, and around the world. And we were, probably what you were alluding to, definitely inspired by the Sunrise Movement in the States, which is a similar structured organisation, organising young people in a sort of electoral strategy to elect Green New Deal, I don't know if they call them champions, but Green New Deal supporting politicians in the United States. So yeah, I think Fridays for Future and the climate strikes were big inspirations as well.
Fantastic, yeah, definitely endorse those opinions. Really good examples of what we can all be doing. Yeah, I guess actually something that sparked something in my mind, just to follow up on one of the points that you made there about going to, I guess, key parts of the country where you know, where this really matters, kind of tied in with the, I guess, at the moment the at-home climate justice implications, if we can just boil it down to that for now. In that, do you see a Green New Deal and wider, I guess, environmental policy making becoming a really potentially difficult question for certain parts of the country which may have traditionally relied on, you know, an industry that is you know, particularly polluting industry or something like that? Could it be seen in certain towns and cities around the country that could become a potential, I guess, battleground? There could be a sort of backlash against a move towards a Green New Deal. Is that something you would think could happen, Ellen?
It's definitely a danger. I think that's why it's important to reach out and to put workers at the forefront of this transition, to make sure that, you know, it's not just a bunch of people talking about workers, but they're, you know, making the plans themselves. I know that Platform has done a lot of really good work, particularly with oil workers in the North Sea. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they did a survey maybe last year, a couple of years ago, about oil workers' attitudes to a just transition. And they found that actually a majority of them were looking for work that was potentially more long-term stable, because they could see that, you know, with climate change and the climate crisis, the oil industry was not in a stable position. They are looking for ways to use their skills in other industries. So it's one of those things that the wrong politicians will spin it as a threat to these communities and their livelihoods. You could definitely transition away from fossil fuels in a dangerous and bad way, thinking of the mining closures of the 80s. But there is a way to do it which doesn't harm people and doesn't take away their agency and their livelihoods, and allows people to use their skills in a fulfilling and well-paid and unionized job. And that's how we're trying to speak about it now.
Yeah, I thought you touched upon that really well actually earlier when you were talking about the Green New Deal, and slightly more specifically when you know, talking about a green jobs guarantee, for example, needs to be really at the forefront at the forefront of this, and things like, 4-day week but with no loss of pay and things like that could be really important tools. Harpreet, I guess I want to give you just a second to, if there's any sort of thing that sparked your thoughts in those answers and those questions before I ask you a specific one there.
Yeah, I think having a really positive vision of how action to address climate change can improve our lives is going to be really, really crucial in my view. We've already seen kind of iterations of the Project Fair around Brexit being experimented with Nigel Farage looking to have a referendum on net zero. And I think that just highlights that it's going to be so important to articulate how action on climate change within the UK and globally has the potential to improve our lives as we transition. It's not something to be afraid of, and that's a really hard sell because so much has to change, and scientists say everything has to change, and that change necessarily invokes fear. And I think that it's going to be a tall order, but one that we will have to meet to kind of sell in a very positive, affirming way for how we can live more connected lives as we transition.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really spelling out a positive vision for what, how life could be is, I think, a really, really crucial part. Really crucial part of this. So specifically for you, Harpreet, we had a question which was kind of focusing, I guess, on the global nature of the Green New Deal, maybe that you're describing, and the implications of it. I guess, when we're thinking about environmental policy making and thinking about trying to be active, it is sometimes difficult to have that really global perspective when you're trying to make change on the ground. So how do we ensure that when we're fighting for a Green New Deal in the UK, that we're not sidelining actually those who could be impacted around the world when we're trying to do a good thing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that that is a really tough question to answer, because everything that we do in the UK has an implication for what happens somewhere else. And I think vaccine hoarding is a really clear articulation of that at the moment. And I think for me, the way in which I've come to answer that question is that whatever campaign you're running, whatever you're focusing on in that moment, and to give the example of transitions, or asking your local authorities to kind of make sure that they'll be buying, the next bus fleets are electric, for example, to look to organizations like Electronics Watch that are building the infrastructure to promote workers' rights throughout the supply chain. And when you're doing that work, and it can be a very specific localized campaign around transport, but that you're trying to build those connections with the institutions and organizations that are trying to build global workers' power. And that is absolutely really crucial. And there's different ways of doing that. So we've been talking at the moment with groups that have been running Stop Cambo campaigns as well, around how, yes, we need to stop oil and gas extraction within the UK, but the UK also has to pay for climate financing, both to help communities transition and adapt, but also to repair the consequences of the events that I was speaking to earlier, which is in technical UNFCCC speak called loss and damage climate financing, for which nothing is specifically available at the moment. And so again, when running these types of campaigns, to think in terms of what the UK needs to stop doing and what it needs to start doing to repair the consequences of the ways in which it has and continues to treat land and labour in the south as sites and as people to be extracted and exploited. And so part of that is political education work, which you're doing here through this event, and part of it is picking a campaign and understanding what the global implications of that campaign are, and working in solidarity with groups outside of the UK that are working to address that.
Brilliant. Yeah, I obviously I'm slightly biased, but I think political education is good as a general rule of thumb. I think is a good approach. I've got, I guess, a slightly related question for you, Harpreet, before I direct one back at Ellen in a moment. But you kind of talked throughout that there's a link here, obviously, between colonialism, climate justice, and we've really been seeing over the last, obviously, few weeks and months that the Tory government is really trying to stop us from talking about colonialism. So how do you think that can potentially impact upon the climate justice movement, and how are we going to combat that?
I think it says something that they're that scared to talk about their own history, that they need to go to these types of lengths, that it hits a nerve. I don't know, except to say that we have to continue to do it, and that just you know, even as this government is determined to limit our rights to gather, to kind of invoke the rights that have led to every positive change that Ellen drew on at the beginning of today's meeting, we will, you know, we have to make choices between what is moral and what might become increasingly restricted in terms of creating a fear around what we can do and what we can say. I think that there's a very strange culture in the UK to kind of be proud of a colonial legacy, and I think that talking about the ways in which that legacy exists in very, very direct ways. So using figureheads like Lloyd's of London, which is an insurance syndicate based in London and is the insurer of last resort for fossil fuel pipelines through remaining territories that remain in Indigenous territory, remain in Indigenous ownership or hold through Australia and Canada, fossil fuel pipelines that will see us breach thresholds for 1.5 beyond 2 degrees. That's putting more than 2 billion people's lives at risk for food, water, security and heat stress. And that's not even including sea level rise implications and flooding and everything else. So billions of people's lives are at risk just through the insurance of these kinds of projects. And this same corporation insured slave ships, insured enslaved peoples. Its founders were given reparations for the loss of enslaved people as property. And we have to be drawing these links between how we've arrived at a system that has treated people and places as property, and that continues to, that has driven the climate crisis and the position that we find ourselves in. So kind of using companies like that, where it's so egregious and it's so clear that there's this long historical link, to have these conversations, and then to watch the UK's net zero plans, because it can't say that a territory in Senegal, for example, will grow eucalyptus, which will implicate communities' access to land to grow food, that will extract water from local territories, that increases fire risk, that could take decades to actually have any positive impact in terms of reductions of emissions if it doesn't burn down before the trees actually grow to the strength that it takes for them to have a tangible impact. That is and has been described by global climate justice groups as a form of carbon colonialism, and that has to be consistently called out.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really, really powerful statement and something that we all need to be doing. So I'm going to throw a couple more questions because I realize we're probably coming towards the end of our time, so I don't want to keep everyone for too long, but I'm going to try and sort of again bundle some questions. I need to apologize basically to everyone who has sent me questions. I think I'm only scratching the surface with where we've got to here, so a lot of you might go away disappointed if you need your specific question to be asked. But I guess I've got a question for Ellen here. So we had a question about the Labour Party's position on a Green New Deal and where its announced policy is, and I guess where you may see it's how far away it is from something that needs, to being up to standard, basically. And also I was going to roll in another side to that question, if that's okay, where we had a questioner asking about the role of sort of public ownership and public control in a Green New Deal, and I wonder if those potentially might be tying together. Not to direct your answer too much.
Thanks. Yeah, okay, Labour Party position. Actually, just really quickly, I wanted to share this climate justice messaging guide that was put together by 350 and Neon and a few others, just in relation to the last question, because I think Harpreet's absolutely right that we have to just keep going and keep being really loud and unapologetic about the need for climate justice. But there's a section of the population who some organizations in their strategy, in order to be part of this movement ecology and win a Green New Deal and win climate justice, will be needing to talk to, who are maybe not ready to hear some of the stuff that we would like to tell them. This messaging guide goes through that and basically is really helpful in giving suggestions of how to talk about things like colonialism and the UK's historic responsibility in a way that doesn't put people off before you get to asking them to take action. So it's more of a kind of comms specific resource that's useful in a very particular case, but I find it really helpful in different campaigns. Labour Party position on the Green New Deal. So interestingly, Keir Starmer said in an interview today that he would absolutely like Labour to be the party who is known for its Green New Deal, which is very encouraging. But we've heard different things from him. When one of our organisers confronted him at Labour Party conference last year, as you might have seen, he totally blanked her, didn't want to say anything. So we've got mixed messages from Labour. They have sort of proposed quite a lot of funding for a sort of green transition, but they have not, the front bench have not signed up to the Green New Deal bill, which is the one that you mentioned, Carolyn Lucas and a few others have tabled, and is currently on its way through Parliament as a private member's bill and also an early day motion. The front bench have basically said they won't sign up to this. They'd have to resign from the front bench if they did, because Labour would like to put forward their own Green New Deal bill. Which from our perspective, great if they're up for leading in the next Parliament on retabling a Green New Deal bill with all the same provisions in it, the same, 5 pillars, and doing that work, then we're totally agnostic about which parliamentarians' names are on the top of the paper. I think it's a bit territorial of them to be refusing to sign something because it has other party members' names on it. But there are also a lot of Labour MPs who have signed up. And so clearly, it's one of those things that is backbenchers are persuadable, and a lot of them are definitely on board. A lot of the front benches I think are on board as well, but for political reasons can't sign up. And Labour really want to be seen to be introducing their own Green New Deal and doing it in their own way. So remains to be seen whether that will cover all the aspects that we need it to. You know, Keir Starmer's also talked about sort of reducing tax on fuel duty and that kind of thing, policies that might not contribute to a Green New Deal. And he's also got a record of saying all sorts of things and then doing the opposite. So it's a little bit hard to tell where we are with him. So we're going to keep the pressure on, basically. We're going to keep challenging the front bench in particular and saying, come on, you know, this is the most important issue of our lifetimes. This is not something to be territorial about. You're either with us or you're against us. And it's as simple as that. And if they want to take the lead and draft the next version of the Green New Deal bill, then fantastic. But they have not committed to doing that yet. The role of public ownership was the second part. Gosh, I've gone on a bit. I could talk way too much about this because my last job was at We Own It, which is a campaign for public ownership, as you mentioned. So it's all rattling around in my brain still. I mentioned the democratic economy as part of one of the pillars of the Green New Deal's idea of having more democratic participation in our economy so that it works for people and communities, not for corporations, not for banks and big businesses. And I think public ownership is a massive part of that. And in some ways, the level of government intervention that's going to be required to sort of wind down the fossil fuel industries and other related industries is kind of on a level with nationalizing in some ways. So I think definitely public ownership has a strong role to play in the Green New Deal, of water, of energy, transport, possibly even of the fossil fuel companies themselves as a method of winding them down. But I'm not going to go on too much because I've already talked way too long in that last answer.
No, that's really good. I think actually there's a really nice tie-in here actually, which shows that, you know, through public ownership is how you can potentially ensure, at least on a local level, that climate justice is embedded in something so that we have the democratic accountability and we have some control over these things to ensure that any transition is just and fair. I did have a as I said before, there are plenty more questions, but I think probably we'll start to wind up. So I've got, I guess, a final question for Harpreet before we do a little closing section. Was you mentioned a figure which really sort of hammered things home for me in your talk about 200%, which I think I heard it correctly. 200% of the UK's fair share and budget we've essentially used up. And so in that light, I guess, what do you think the actual fair share for tackling the UK's responsibility for climate change actually is? How do you go from here when we've already overstepped by 200%? How could you go here in any sort of a just and fair way?
So what I'm going to say is going to sound incredibly ambitious. So it goes back to kind of how do we build towards making what might currently seem politically impossible as something that is absolutely inevitable. And I think joining movements and grassroots groups and getting more involved in Green New Deal Rising and Young Greens and local groups is absolutely an essential component of how we build the power to make parts of what I'm saying, parts of what I'm not saying, and that we need to co-create and build absolutely inevitable. But 250 is too late. The UK needs to start a huge retraining, reskilling initiatives that helps people transition into jobs that are going to build flood defences, that are going to retrofit homes, that are going to change the way we move, that are going to make communities have what they need in smaller distances. So we need to travel less and have what we need closer to home, and we need to do it really, really, really fast. And 2030 would have been ideal and may have been possible if we started these retraining projects a few years ago, but as close as possible to 2030 And that's locally, and that means working with unions that are saying, okay, our jobs in car manufacturing are moving from Birmingham would actually prefer to, make electric vehicles, and how can we have grassroots groups that come out in support of transitions and elect the leaders with the work that you're all doing to make that inevitable. And the other part of it is that's the 100% of decarbonisation within the UK as fast as possible element, and the other 100% is a redistribution of wealth globally to ensure that the countries that have done very, very, very little to contribute our crisis aren't paying to transition when the intellectual property for a lot of the technology is being hoarded by countries, aren't still paying debts to colonizers and to companies within colonizers. Just wiping off debt that's owed could create so much space in so-called developing countries' economies to be able to invest in the same kinds of things that I'm saying we need within the UK. And then on top of that, to pay climate financing. And in a kind of context of precarity and years of austerity within the UK, I think that can feel really scary. And I think that we need to talk about this in a way that advocates a new economy within the UK and globally, an economy where working class people that have seen the cost of living skyrocket, homelessness increase, energy bills increase, see that they have more power and control over what a fair economy looks like here and globally as well, and kind of making that link between global redistribution and local redistribution. And as the Framing Climate Justice Guide says, to start with the local as a way of kind of bringing into the global redistributive element and finding new ways to talk about these things. And the far right is really scared that this is what we want, and they're right, this is what we want. We just need to build power faster and bolder so that it's what we win, and they don't get the kind of bigger borders and militarized policing and dystopia that they're advocating for.
Brilliant. Right. Well, let's just go and do it then. Sounds like that was, yeah, really, really inspiring. I want some Zoom reactions, actual reactions, whatever you want to do. Show your appreciation in any way possible for these two amazing guests. Yeah, there was lots more questions. I'm very sorry for those whose questions weren't read out. Just trying to fit them all together, but absolutely fascinating discussion. And actually, you almost teed us up quite well there, Harpreet, with our next discussion when you're talking about building a fairer economy at home as well, because that's what we are looking at next week. So this was the second of our 6-week political education series. But next week, on Wednesday, the 26th of January, we're going to be holding a panel and Q&A called Resilient Communities, Universal Basic Income and Services. So this talk is going to kind of build on this justice discussion, but take it to the local level, I guess, and examine a couple of proposals about how we can build social justice at home through the lens of a universal basic income and universal basic services. So joining us for that discussion are two more fantastic guests. So we'll have Guy Standing, who is a co-founding member of the Basic Income Earth Network, and he's also an author and academic, and Maeve Cohen, who's the project lead at the Social Guarantee. It's sure to be a great discussion, so please do join us. To make sure you don't miss out, you can sign up to the session right away. So we are going to share the link in the chat, so that you can make sure that you have got your RSVP'd right away. Please share that link with anyone else who you think would be interested, friends, family, inside the Green Party, outside of the Green Party. We want to really spread the message far and wide. And we'd really appreciate if you could start sharing that message now, actually. So, you know, I hope you agree that tonight's panel was absolutely fascinating. I feel like I've learned loads, and I'm going to have to go off and do more research. But one way of sharing how interesting that panel was is by sharing it on social media. So we've actually prepared a click to tweet so that you can you know, very easily just share how amazing that discussion was and get people to come along next week so that we can build some momentum behind this political education series. Again, we're sharing that in the chat, so if you could post, that would be amazing. Please add your own thoughts on you know, personalize it. We want to see who comes up with the most interesting thing to say online. And finally, before I leave you to get on with your evenings, because I realized I said I would try and wind this up by 1:45, but the discussion was too interesting, so I had to let it go. But before I let you go, you know, we've heard a fantastic discussion tonight, but it does take behind the scenes, you know, work, dedication and enthusiasm to put events on, as well as, you know, wider things that we're involved with to do with campaigns and elections in the Young Greens. So if you enjoyed tonight and you think that political education is useful and worthwhile and want to hear more from us, if you could please consider supporting us with a regular gift, would be absolutely amazing. You know, even just the price of a cup of coffee once a month shows your support, and it puts us in a better position to plan ahead so that we can continue to put forward more great events like this. And it also can support our campaigning and election-based activities as well, so that we can, you know, win the political transformation that we've been discussing tonight. We'll share that link in the chat so that we could, you know, so that you can sign up and support us right away whilst you're nice and inspired. But the last thing really is just to say a massive thank you again to Ellen and to Harpreet. You know, really fantastic insight. I've learned a lot. We will just send around a follow-up email. There's lots of links that you can get from tonight that will help inform, you know, your future activities, and a bit of more background about the kind of things that both of these guys are involved in, so that you can find out more about them. So keep an eye out for that and sign up for our next session, and I will finally let you go to enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thanks, everyone.